Hello and welcome to Represent NYC from Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, your host and the executive editor of Gotham Gazette. The 2021 general election is here, and along with voting for local offices in New York City and beyond, like mayor and city council and borough president, there are also 5 yes or no questions that will be on your ballot. These are 5 proposals regarding potential changes to the New York State Constitution that will be voted on by voters across the state this fall. We're pleased to bring you a special episode on these 5 questions so you can be prepared to vote them up or down as you see fit. In just a moment, I'll introduce you to our 4 great expert panelists with me for this discussion on the 5 ballot questions. And we hope you're getting ready to vote in the general election that will be decided through absentee balloting, the early voting period of October 23rd through October 31st, and election day is Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. Along with these 5 ballot questions on state constitutional amendments, on your general election ballot in New York City are races for city council, borough president, comptroller, public advocate, mayor, and more, including district attorney in some cases like Manhattan. Here on MNN, we're bringing you a series of interviews and debates to help you prepare to vote. And of course, you can find a great deal of coverage and information on the elections from us at GothamGazette.com. On to the focus of today's show. Voters will vote yes or no on each of these 5 ballot proposals. If a majority of New Yorkers across the state vote yes, then these changes dealing with things like voting rights, legislative redistricting, and a right to clean air and water, and more, will go into effect. These proposed constitutional amendments are on the ballot because they've been passed by the state legislature in 2 consecutive terms and now go to the voters to be approved or disapproved. In brief, and we'll get into more detail with our guests in just one moment, the 5 ballot proposals relate to 1, amending the apportionment and redistricting process in several ways. 2, asserting a right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment for all New Yorkers. 3, eliminating the 10-day advance voter registration requirement, paving the way for what's known as same-day voter registration. 4, authorizing no excuse absentee ballot voting, paving the way for more New Yorkers to have the option to vote by mail without providing an excuse. And 5, increasing the jurisdiction of the New York City Civil Court, allowing that court to hear and decide claims up to $50,000 instead of the current $25,000. So that's a brief overview, but there's more to each of these, and my guests today will get into that in just a second. They are Melody Lopez is Executive Director of the New York Civic Engagement Table. Eric Friedman is Assistant Executive Director for Public Affairs at the New York City Campaign Finance Board, which runs NYC Votes. Pamela Stewart-Martinez is Community Organizer for Voter Engagement at We Act for Environmental Justice. And Jeffrey M. Wice is Adjunct Professor and Senior Fellow, New York Census and Redistricting Institute at New York Law School. Thank you all for being here. We have a lot to get to, so let's get into it. Jeff Wice, proposal number 1 on apportionment and redistricting. It has several components to it. Can you give us an overview of those, please?
Well, sure, I'd be delighted to. This is an important amendment because it addresses a very pressing issue, that redistricting or the redrawing of our congressional, state senate, and state assembly lines be done in a timely manner so as to allow for the 2022 election cycle to proceed without a snag. But in 2019, the legislature moved the September fall primary to June. And that means that for a June primary, candidates need to start circulating petitions sometime beginning in late February or early March. So what the amendment does is speeds up or moves up the deadlines for the state commission and the legislature to finalize the new lines, so that instead of the current timetable, which could stretch all the way into March or later, that the commission finish up its work sometime by early January. A second major feature of the amendment is that it systematizes or makes more regular the voting process for the redistricting commission and the legislature to approve new maps, that the current law bases approval on who controls the legislature. And there's no provision anywhere else in state law that basically requires a 2/3 vote if the legislature is controlled by both parties, or a simple majority if there's divided control. It just brings more uniformity, regularity, and less games playing into the approval process. The amendment also makes part of the Constitution the reallocation of incarcerated individuals who are in state prisons, to reallocate them or put them back into their homes of record prior to incarceration. This is a major civil rights issue. What we've seen in the past are thousands of people in prisons filling up rural area legislative districts where the Census Bureau counts them during the census. So we're going to see in the amendment a more permanent language to make the prisoner reallocation language part of the Constitution. That, in a nutshell, is why this amendment is really important right now.
All right, and there are some pieces of question 1 that will come back to you, Jeff Wice, in a few minutes to talk about some of the arguments being made for and against, but let's move on to question 2. Pamela Stewart-Martinez, ballot question 2, give us a brief overview, please.
So basically, ballot question 2 is the right to clean air and water, as well as having a right to a healthful environment. And I mean, in recent years, we've watched the news and we've heard about different states, sometimes in our state, issues with air quality, issues with water, and just environmental issues in different communities throughout the state. So this isn't anything new. This kind of amendment has already been done in other states successfully. Pennsylvania, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Montana. So the plan is to follow suit with what they're doing, because in the case of Pennsylvania, this has been part of their constitution for 50 years. So that's pretty much the gist of the ballot question number 2.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of some of the push behind this to add it to the state constitution, that in essence does what? It gives more impetus to state lawmakers to really think about that when crafting the laws of the state, and it opens up New Yorkers to, you know, really ensure their rights to these things.
Right now, people feel like there are some laws on the books regarding environmental issues that are not being enforced. And people feel that if this was part of our state constitution, if it actually becomes part of our state constitution, it will force folks to enforce it, and it'll have that judicial push behind it.
Got it, thank you. All right, we'll come back a little bit to the arguments for and against in a minute. Melody Lopez, questions 3 and 4, one at a time, please. The gist of each of those, please.
Sure, I'm happy to share that. So question 3 is regarding the voter registration deadline. And essentially what the proposal does is remove the deadline. In our state constitution, there is a 10-day voter registration deadline that is required. And the language is actually relatively simple compared to some of the other ballot questions, and it's simply removing that 10-day deadline. And I know that might be confusing because the deadline currently in practice is longer than that. It's 25 days. I know our organization's been asked about that, but that's actually a statute and that was passed by the legislature and not in our constitution. The constitution only mandates 10 days, but this proposal, if passed, would do away with all of that. And Ben, as you mentioned in the outset, would pave the way for same-day registration. However, this ballot proposal does not enact same-day registration. It only does away with the deadline requirement, and and it will enable the legislature to pass legislation creating a policy that would be something like same-day registration, which is what they've articulated as their goal. So that's essentially the gist of proposal 3. And on to proposal 4 is making no excuse absentee voting permanent in the state of New York. As folks may have known in the past, before the pandemic, voters were required to provide an excuse in order to vote absentee. So if people who may be viewing may have been out of town, maybe have an illness, maybe some reason, have to fill out the form and check off what that reason is, and then get their ballot in the mail or pick it up at the Board of Elections. This proposal will do away with any requirements around excuse, and will be kind of creating a permanent state, which has been kind of temporary, sort of a temporary state during the pandemic, where even though it's still an excuse, but everybody can claim temporary illness due to the pandemic. So just so folks know now, for this election coming up in November, you could still vote absentee under that temporary enabling opportunity, but this proposal will do away with all of that complexity and just make it much more straightforward, so that folks can then just request their ballots and get them in the mail without having to offer any excuse in the future if it passes.
Right, and in some ways, both questions 3 and 4 sort of remove things to allow the legislature to then enact new things, and in some ways shifting here in question 4 the potential from really even calling it absentee balloting to which sort of implies you're absent and you have an excuse to do it by mail, and moving to more mail-in voting. Eric Friedman, on questions 3 and 4, especially related to voting processes, how do you and the Campaign Finance Board and NYC Vote sort of see these ballot proposals as part of the bigger picture around voting in New York?
Sure. Well, one thing that I think you kind of raised this issue, one thing that both of these questions seek to do is kind of update voting practice to match what voters have been experiencing, right? So, Melody mentioned the current requirement that it's in statute that voters register 25 days before the election, goes further than what's in the state constitution. The boards of elections have for a long time said they needed that time to print those poll books that you see at the voting site that, used to be when you checked in, a poll worker would page through the site, find your last name, and you'd sign your name there. If you've been to vote in the last couple of years, and I imagine a lot of your viewers have, you've been signing in on those tablets. Right, so the voter lists are online. They don't need to print those books. They don't need the extra time to print those books to check people in at the poll site. So, technology has kind of rendered that deadline obsolete. So what we're left with as a matter of policy, should there be a deadline or not? We could talk a little bit about what the pros and cons are. But no excuse absentee balloting is largely the same. Melody kind of alluded to this also. We've been experiencing no excuse absentee ballot in New York for the last year and a half. I mean, put more precisely, the executive order gave everyone an excuse that applied to everyone, right? So it used to be, because of that language on the ballot, New York State had very, very low percentage of people voting absentee, maybe 3 or 4% in any given election. All of a sudden in June of last year, you had close to a third of people voting in the primaries that year by absentee because of COVID. More than a quarter in November 2020. More than 1 million absentee ballots in both of those elections in New York City because of the public safety concerns in the response to COVID. So folks have been using absentee to vote in huge numbers over the past year. They've gotten used to it, and this is something that voters will likely learn to have grown to understand, to appreciate, and so they'll have the opportunity if they choose to make that permanent going forward in November.
All right, let me come back to you in just one second, Eric Friedman, about what the Campaign Finance Board and NYC Votes are doing to, beyond appearing on this show, of course, educate the public as everybody's getting ready to vote. But I just want to mention again, question 5 on the ballot. We're not really going into a lot of detail here. It's perhaps the most simple. Again, increases the New York City civil court's jurisdiction, allowing it to hear and decide claims up to $50,000 instead of the limit currently at $25,000. Eric, just coming back to you briefly on all of these and the outreach efforts and where beyond this program voters can get more information. Tell us what you're doing and where people can find more information. And then we're going to go around to everybody again to talk a little bit about some of the arguments being made for and against each of these questions.
Thank you, Ben. So the first thing I'll mention, you're going to look for one of these in your mailbox coming soon. So our voter guide, if you're a registered voter in New York City, you'll get one of these in the mail. It will have kind of a basic summary language on all of these ballot proposals, and in plain language, let you know, A, what you'll expect on the ballot, and B, what each question will do. If you go to voting.nyc online, you will see our online voter guide, which will have expanded information about each of these ballot proposals. It will, we've been soliciting statements from the public, both pro and con, for each of these questions, and you'll have an opportunity to read through those if you visit our voting guide at voting.nyc, along with profiles of all the candidates and video statements from everyone. We have been also conducting a series of seminars and kind of discussions of these ballot proposals. On voting.nyc, you can see a schedule of events that we have coming up before the election. But you know, we're also you know, if you'd like us to come talk to your organization and learn more about these ballot proposals, we're happy to show up and spend some time.
If you're a registered voter in New York City, look for one of those voting guides. But again, as Eric said, you can go online for more information. And it's I was looking at this in preparation for this discussion. The curation of just public comments on yes or no on these questions is helpful to peruse. Voting is coming up. The early voting period is October 23rd through October 31st, and then election day is November 2nd, and absentee balloting is currently happening. So it is all happening, these 5 ballot questions and the races for mayor and so on. All right, so let's go around again here and talk about these questions and some of the arguments that are being made for and against. Jeff Wice, the question 1 is fairly controversial. There's arguments for and against. There's a variety of pieces to it. So it's often the case that some of the people, some of the groups that are either in support or against, they like parts of this, but there's parts they don't like. And sometimes the positive feelings outweigh the negatives. But what are some of the arguments in brief being made in support and against question 1?
Well, the major arguments in support of the redistricting amendment focus on the lack of what the 2014 amendment left out. It was incomplete. It did not address the full picture of how to redistrict the right way. But the overriding reason that the amendment really needs to be voted on this year is to address the dilemma of the 2022 spring primary and the late dates in the current Constitution. Also, the language in the legislation in the amendment is supported by many people because it removes the favoritism over one political party over another. You know, there are a complicated set of rules in the amendment that call for different kinds of votes depending on whether the Democrats, Republicans control the legislature, whether there's a split legislature, whether one party controls the legislature, and nowhere else in the Constitution is there preference given to one party over another, depending on who controls the legislature. Now, on the other hand, there are opponents of the amendment who argue that by changing the rules, you would deny the minority party. Right now, the Assembly and Senate are controlled by the Democrats, and under current law, that would require a 2/3 vote in both chambers to approve a redistricting plan. The amendment would simply bring that down to a simple majority. But at the redistricting commission level, there are 10 members right now, 8 of whom are appointed by the 4 legislative leaders, and there are 2 independent members. There are 10 altogether, no tiebreaker. Under current rules, you need to have 7 members of the commission vote to approve a plan, including one member each from the 4 separate legislative leader appointments. The amendment would simply require any 7 commission members to approve a plan, essentially removing the minority party's almost veto power or approval power that you've got now. So that's the main sticking point, is over removing the minority party's ability to weigh in on the plan. But the supporters of the amendment argue that it's silly to single out different political parties in a document like the state constitution.
Got it. Thank you. You hear a few rumblings also from some of the legislators and others who represent areas home to some of the state's prisons that don't want to see the reapportionment of those incarcerated to their home addresses. But
if I could just add on that point,
sure.
The reallocation of inmates was undertaken for the Assembly and Senate in 2010. And there was a challenge brought by a group of Republican state senators against that law. And the State Court of Appeals upheld that law. New York is now one of 12 states. It's a growing number of states that look at this issue as a civil rights issue, as a fairness and equity issue, that we don't want to have phantom filler populations in districts where the people in the prisons are essentially residents of other communities, primarily communities in urban areas, and that's really where they ought to be counted for purposes of representation.
Thank you. Pamela Stewart-Martinez, back to you. Ballot question 2, 1 or 2 of the major arguments for and 1 or 2 against.
Well, I mean, obviously, clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment, how can that not appeal to everyone?
It's almost a little self-evident. Yes, the pro is almost a little self-evident. Yes.
Exactly. So that's the pros of it. And most people would feel that is what we should strive for. We're in New York State. We should want this for all New Yorkers. The people or the folks who are opposed to this feel that it would open the floodgate of our court system, that we would be inundated with court cases and people trying to sue for all kinds of stuff. They feel as though there isn't like clear-cut parameters when it comes to what is exactly a healthful environment. And so they feel like it's just not enough information. And again, our courts will be filled with nuisance cases.
Right. That's the main argument I've heard against, is concerns about litigation. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, on the other hand, it may act as a motivation to different groups to be more responsible in their communities, to act better, to do better, because there will be consequences. So, yes.
And you had mentioned, I think, in your opening remarks on this, in terms of how widespread this type of protection is in the country, and if this has been a growing trend or not. Can you say again how this fits into sort of the bigger picture?
Well, there are other states who've actually passed this, and it's in their Bill of Rights. You have Pennsylvania, you have Massachusetts, you have Montana, and you have Hawaii. So they've all passed it. And in the case of Pennsylvania, it's been in place for over 50 years. So clearly it's been done, and it's not problematic to them. But some would say that their population is smaller than New York State.
Okay.
So,
all right, that's an interesting smattering of examples there. We're in our last few minutes here, so thank you, Pamela. I want to come back to Melody Lopez and Eric Friedman. Just a couple of arguments. Are there arguments, Melody, that you've heard that are popular against ballot question 3, which would reduce the registration window and pave the way for same-day voter registration, where people could register and vote on the same day? Are there arguments against that one? Again, the benefits there are almost self-evident. What have we heard a chorus of folks against?
I mean, if I'm being very honest, definitely have not heard a chorus, at least in my experience. I certainly definitely, as a leader in this organization that works with lots of voting rights organizations, it's a near unanimous support from the voting rights community of this policy. And it's a very pro-voter, expansive, access improving policy. I think there's been a lot of research into how the positive impact on enabling folks to be able to participate in elections. The only argument that I've come across, and I don't know if it's quite to the level of a chorus, is potential concerns raised by Republicans around shortening the voter registration deadline could lead to voter fraud. However, there hasn't been really concrete evidence supporting that concern, but that's the only thing I've heard.
And that's similar to the argument against 4 expanding mail-in voting. Is those similar, almost completely unfounded concerns about fraud in the mail-in voting system? Are there any others on 4, Melody or Eric, that are out there? And we just got one more minute here before we unfortunately have to wrap up. But anything else on 4 which would expand the possibilities for absentee mail-in balloting?
I mean, again, I think there are existing protections against fraud, and I think there are concerns that we've heard both about absentee voting and about same-day registration in that respect. But we've got existing protections against fraud in voter registration. Voters are required to provide a social security number or driver's license in order to register now. We haven't had the enabling legislation written, but there are states that require additional proof of residence when you come to the polls, such as a utility bill. I think we've got robust protections against fraud, existing protections against fraud when it comes to absentee balloting. And so, while fraud is not non-existent, it is vanishingly rare.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I think those are some of the arguments, I guess, we hear from proponents who might be responding to those concerns.
And I'll add that you hear changes to the voting rules and laws. Sometimes people worry about different boards of elections being able to handle those changes, but again, that's more of an issue for dealing with how those boards of elections are run, and folks should vote on these amendments whether they believe in the amendments or not with too many concerns about the operations of the Board of Elections. All right, we have to leave it there. I really appreciate all 4 of you joining me for this discussion. It's been really helpful. Obviously, we already went over how voters can find more information on these, but everybody read up, watch this again to hear the arguments and the discussions around. Look for the voter guide online, in your mailbox, etc. All of our guests here and their organizations have put out lots of information as well, so you can find those. Thank you for watching this edition of Represent NYC from Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max from Gotham Gazette. Please do be ready to vote in the upcoming elections and vote yes or no on these 5 ballot questions. Talk to you soon.